Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the Loins of History podcast. I'm your host, Colin, and I'm joined by my co-host, Jay. Today's episode is going to be a continuation of what we discussed on the last episode. And where we left off was discussing political parties and leaving off at a pivotal moment in American history, the end of World War II. And obviously, World War II had massive ramifications throughout world history, and it's obviously a very significant event, but particularly to political parties. And we left off discussing three things that we think are really going to influence the future of political parties and how we ended up where we're at today. And those were the USSR, the Cold War, communism, the civil rights movement, and the economic boom and the unprecedented wealth that spread throughout the middle class in America. So with that being said, Jay, can you pick up where we left off? I think we were transitioning right into the Vietnam era and the Cold War.
Yeah, absolutely. So we saw, as we discussed in our last episode, the Democrats post-Great Depression began to dominate the American political scene. FDR, with his huge triumph of winning 4 back-to-back presidential elections, kind of solidified that whatever FDR was doing, the American people liked and wanted more of. His successor, though, Harry Truman, was a wicked smart dude, a very down-to-earth man. However, he had difficulty navigating the post-World War II world order. Korea was more or less seen as a debacle, failed police action. Well, I don't know if it was a failed police action, but we certainly didn't win in the same emotionally satisfying way as we did World War II. And Dwight Eisenhower was able to win the election on the Republican ticket and kind of took power back for the Republicans. This was partially because Americans didn't like the outcome of Korea, and they wanted some policies that they believed Republicans were going to be able to navigate the economic situation a little bit better. And by and large, they did. So of note to here, specifically with foreign policy, at this time, and what I believe kind of throughout American history, Americans tend to be isolationists, meaning that Americans tend to be extremely hesitant to get involved in foreign wars if the United States is not threatened by what's going on. The Republicans, this is a position more consistent with Republicans at that time. Democrats, again, FDR getting us involved in World War II. So that was a big thing in how Eisenhower got elected. Interestingly, though, after Eisenhower ran and had two good terms in office, JFK was elected largely for the very same reasons. One of the main positions that JFK ran on was this idea of a missile gap, and he successfully made it look like Eisenhower was being weak against the Russians, that the military was, there were quite a few budget cuts after Korea. There was downsizing like there always is after a major war. Again, very consistent with the Republican Party platform, with smaller government, less government spending, etc. And JFK, as a Democrat, was able to run on this ticket that we were losing the missile armament war, so to speak, against the Russians. And Nixon, being Eisenhower's vice president, kind of looked stupid and looked very stressed during these debates.
So it's kind of interesting, almost ironic, that the Supreme Allied Commander of World War II, hero for the Allies, was considered weak on an enemy. He had a great slogan: "I like Ike, you like Ike."
We do. We like Ike.
It's a great jingle that got stuck in your head. To be honest, I think Ike probably could have run on the Communist Party ticket and still won. He was so popular, but I just think it kind of goes to show that that's how ingrained some of these When you're a Republican, even if you were a Supreme Allied Commander of World War II, the idea that we're going to have America first and potentially focus inward versus out on military expenditure is the way you want to go. That was the perception at the time. And then to your point about Nixon and looking, it's interesting actually. There was a poll that I read once where they asked people who listened to the debates on the radio who they thought won, and Nixon won. But if you watch TV, because JFK was a young guy, I think he had a good makeup artist. He was made for TV. They thought he won only because of his poise and how comfortable he looked, whereas Nixon looked like he was gaunt and just saw a ghost. So just kind of an interesting, we make decisions off of emotions and sometimes we're irrational. That was unrelated to anything you just said, but I thought that was a good point.
No, you're fine. I think JFK is worth thinking about here for a little bit, because JFK, similar to FDR, is kind of the ideal Democrat during the 20th century. He was young, he was smart, the ladies clearly loved him, and he loved them back.
Right, the secret tunnel,
and he helped navigate the country through some pretty tumultuous times. The 60s were wild. Go ahead, Colin.
I was going to say, they were. This is purely anecdotal, but I talked to a relative who, and this was back in the summer of 2020 when there was all the riots and the election was coming up, and it was a crazy time. And I asked them, what they thought of it. They said, it feels like I'm living through the 60s again. And obviously they were fairly young, in their late teens at the time. But yeah, they were crazy. If you can think about it, there's the civil rights movement. There were riots all the time. There were race riots. There was political unrest. There was unrest all over college campuses. And you're right. JFK was kind of this young guy he was a new face to some of these older policies that they wanted to evolve. He wasn't an old man in a wheelchair. Sorry, FDR. He was a young man. He was the new face of the New Deal. And I think Johnson ended up continuing some of those policies.
Now, to be fair, JFK was assassinated in 1963. So he was, he was around only during the first 3 years of the 60s, but shortly after he was inaugurated, he had to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was the Bay of Pigs incident. Now that one was totally his fault. Actually, fun fact. The CIA had planned and already initiated the basic workup to Bay of Pigs under the Eisenhower administration. Tim Weiner talks about that in he has a couple books on the CIA that are good and bad, but they're interesting. Anyway, fun fact.
Depends on your perspective.
And JFK essentially didn't stop it. He basically was briefed. The CIA was like, "Hey, we're going to do this thing. You cool?" And he's like, "Okay." Anyway. Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis. We had already placed advisors in Vietnam. We were also trying to get through guerrilla movements in the Philippines. There were quite a few things going on.
The space race.
That,
though I don't think that was as big. When I say it was a big deal, because that was really the U.S. versus the USSR, and there was a lot of public pressure not to lose. And we had already lost I think at this point, Sputnik had already been launched. They may have already orbited the Earth before. They had probably already orbited the Earth before JFK was assassinated. But we were not winning the space race. We kind of pulled it out at the end there with landed on the moon. But JFK had a lot of pressure. And I think that was another thing that, just to your point about him being kind of a new face, he also said, we're going to win the space race. And he kind of made it. He popularized the term the space race, and it gave the country something to root for. So,
no, it's worth comparing and contrasting, kind of just to help us understand what JFK was dealing with, and really what the political parties were dealing with on the whole. And that was, if you kind of think about, obviously these are rough macro comparisons here, but if you think about the American political environment during the 1800s versus the American political climate of the 1900s, one of the main differences between those two things was the primary issues that the political parties had to navigate through during the 1800s were nearly exclusively domestic. Yes, there's exceptions to that rule. You know, we talked about as early as Thomas Jefferson went and sent the Marines to North Africa to go clean up some issues there. It's like, yes, there's exceptions to that rule, but by and large, the average American citizen could really care less about what was going on outside of the United States. So it's important to keep that in mind that during the 19th century, during the 20th century, the 1900s, the American political parties are navigating kind of a whole new world in that some of the major issues that they had to work their way through were international issues. The Spanish-American War first, but then World War I and World War II, to a much greater extent, it placed the United States, what used to be the early republic, what is now the world superpower, on the global stage, and how Republicans and Democrats navigated these crises was, if the public approved, they got reelected. If the public didn't approve, they didn't get elected. And for JFK in particular, he spent quite a bit of time and energy simply trying to navigate the Cold War, trying to navigate civil rights, trying to navigate, not thinking about the Cold War. It wasn't just Russia. It was just the global threat of communism. You know, this is the height of the Red Scare.
Containment. Yeah. That's what it was. It was containment. How do we contain this red menace? Vietnam, we had just Korea, an armistice was signed, but now we're in Vietnam. He's got Cuba he's dealing with. Yeah, you're right. It was all over. How do we stop it? We're looking at Europe. The Berlin Wall was built. So
yeah, so that's a great segue to Vietnam. That, in my mind, is the political stage that was set for the debacle that was the American intervention in Vietnam, or what we know as the Vietnam War. JFK again was elected on a platform of the United States. Eisenhower and Nixon are weak against Russia. They are allowing communism to defeat democracy globally. We've got to do something about it. So when he shows up, this random country in East Asia, Southeast Asia, that most Americans could literally care less about at that time. Love Vietnam. I actually have a lot of friends from Vietnam. Great people.
They're actually pro. It's kind of weird. They're actually very pro-American now. So it's almost like capitalism won in the end.
Well, there's still lots of problems there. They're still communist.
There's a McDonald's in what used to be Ho Chi Minh City. Right. So
no, that's a good point.
That's the equivalent of the American flag.
Yeah. Anyway, so JFK could not look weak in the fight against communism. So he did what kind of set the precedent. Well, Truman set the precedent in Korea, but it really came to fruition in Vietnam. And that was, hey, the United States is going to get involved, but we're only going to get involved a little bit because we really don't want to be involved. And it was a piecemeal approach that defines American foreign policy to this day. And I really want both our American and our international listeners to understand that we are neither a pacifist nor a warmongering country. And I think history has shown that to be true, regardless of which party is in office. But unfortunately, and I don't think warmongering nor pacifism is the right answer in terms of foreign policy, but also, unfortunately, a piecemeal approach to trying to solve problems internationally just makes the problems way worse. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Holy crap.
Graveyard of empires.
Yeah. And We didn't know what we were doing. We were trying to appease a population that is both simultaneously immensely proud, i.e., we don't want to look weak, and really isolationist at heart. So that leads to bad foreign policy.
You're exactly right. And if you look at Vietnam, and I don't want to go on a tangent about the whole strategy of it, but it was a war really fought on two fronts. In World War II, you had the propaganda that could come home via approved messaging. So it's not like they got to see front lines right there. Vietnam, and same with Korea. Vietnam, you had reporters who were on the front lines. I can't remember the author's name, but the author of We Were Soldiers was there. I mean, he was there in some of the battles. It's I think it was Joey Galloway. Joey Galloway.
And
That's
Hal
it.
Moore.
Fantastic story, but that had never
Great book,
great movie,
and movie.
Fantastic. That had never happened before. So initially JFK, then Lyndon B. Johnson and the Democratic Party had invested. You're right, to your point. They had invested in America looking strong and protecting democracy worldwide. They couldn't commit. They were in this weird in-between phase where it's like, okay, we have to appear strong, but also we can't appear too strong, so we lose the war at home.
Right.
And that is what gets the U.S. in these dire predicaments. It's that we know every 2 years for midterms, every 4 years for a general election, there could be a shift in power, and everything you worked for is undone. So how do we balance that out? And it leads to disastrous results. 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam. I don't know, well over 1 million, several million potentially Vietnamese lost their lives. It was kind of an all for naught. So it was a disaster because we were fighting a war over there, trying to appear strong.
Right.
We were trying to win a war back home with isolationists and increasingly anti-war movement, and we couldn't make up our minds. It was like we were schizophrenics. We couldn't make up our mind. My little diatribe, sorry.
No, it's good, and it's important to think about Vietnam because for the remainder of American history to this day, Vietnam lingers as a like a ghost that continually haunts politicians and policymakers all the time. It was by far the biggest failure universally seen by political parties of our entire nation's history. Therefore, if anything even smells like Vietnam, whichever party that is at risk here is already losing the narrative. Go ahead, Colin.
No, and you use the term narrative. I think so much of today's politics, and that's part of the reason we do this podcast, is to how we got here today. So much of today's political parties are dominated by the narrative. It's going outside, sticking your finger in the air, and seeing which way the wind blows. A lot of that narrative-driven policymaking and decision-making, to Jay's point, it started here. A lot of it started here, or if it didn't start here, it was exacerbated here because it was so unpopular, and it seemed like we were coming apart at the seams. And how do we handle this? And how do we maintain what we stand for and still maintain power back at home? How do you do it? So this just fans the flames of this narrative-driven policies and politics that we see get even worse in the 90s and today. So,
yeah, and we're definitely going to talk about that when we talk about Clinton and Gingrich and into our current day. But it's interesting kind of moving on from the 60s into the 70s here. It's interesting here that Nixon gets elected in the 70s for the exact same reason, almost. I mean, it's not the same thing, but ideologically speaking, the exact same reason that JFK gets elected. And that's because he was able to say the Democrats were weak in foreign policy, right? Nixon's big strength was, big talking point was peace with honor. I remember as a child in one of the restaurants that I grew up in, there was a picture of Nixon loaded to the teeth with guns in the woods, literally had a knife in his mouth. I will never forget this picture. Literally had a knife in his mouth, and he was like stalking in the woods, and the caption was peace with honor.
I'm going to Google that.
I was I remember you know, Nixon is a super interesting fellow because he tried to he's almost kind of like Vladimir.
I think he gets a bad rap in a lot of ways.
Yeah, well, he had some major shortfalls. It's funny because it's like he wasn't stupid. He was a really smart guy. He had a lot of really good ideas. He was also a little strange. He also had some major like paranoia
He
issues.
was a
But
massive
if
control
you're in
freak.
politics, yeah, like Nixon, what's funny is Nixon is kind of the quintessential guy that when you stay in politics for so long, which, oh, by the way, I do not believe our founders ever intended this to be the case, but Nixon was in politics for decades.
Huh.
And
Hmm.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, think about that. Um, and you get weird. You get weird when your full-time job for 30, 40 years is to be a politician. I, the reason why I say that is you begin to lose touch with
Yes.
the average American
Fantastic way
people,
to say
and
it.
that's why like you no longer are a normal American citizen. You're a part of this elite political class that if Americans really knew how elite these people acted, of which Nixon is one of them, they would never win an election.
It's like District 1 in Hunger Games or something like that. It's you're right, it is.
Yeah.
And that's part of the problem we see today. And yeah, you get weird. Yeah, that's the best way to say it. You get weird, you lose touch, you become increasingly paranoid, which can lead to your impeachment. That's something that's exploited by
Mm-hmm.
your political enemies. But can I read real quick to your point about Nixon and some of the ideas that he had and the counter ideas to what the Democrats were pushing. So this is from the Republican Party platform of 1968. It's published on August 5th, 1968. And I'm just going to read like the first couple lines. Twice before, our party, that's the Republicans, gave the people of America leadership at a time of crisis. Leadership which won us peace in place of war, unity in place of discord, compassion in the place of discord. A place of bitterness. A century ago, Abraham Lincoln gave that leadership. From it came one nation consecrated to liberty and justice for all. 15 years later, Dwight D. Eisenhower gave us that leadership. It brought the end of a war, 8 years of peace, enhanced respect in the world, orderly progress at home, and trust of our people in their leaders and themselves. Today, we're in turmoil. And now I'm not going to read the whole thing because it is very long, but if you do, I suggest you just do a Google search. We'll post it on our Patreon page. If you read through it, a lot of the policies are in a direct response, or excuse me, the platform issues are a direct response to how the Democrats have been handling things. He calls for peace at home, i.e., law and order. He calls for peace abroad, i.e., leaving Vietnam, peace with honor. That was the platform. It was basically America first. I hate, that might trigger some people, but that's basically what he was calling first. He was like, hey, we have problems here at home. I suggest we stop worrying about what's going on in Vietnam and come home, because right now we have riots in the streets. We have college campuses that are being, people are basically rioting. Well, they are not basically rioting. They are rioting. That happened in there's a huge one in Madison, Wisconsin. Another one. I think the Democratic convention in '68 had a massive riot too. There's a huge protest out there. So I mean, what he was capturing is very similar to today. We've been in this what a certain politician in 2016 captured. We've been at war for a long time. There's turmoil at home. Let's focus on us for a little while.
Which is a consistent Republican position up until this point. Now we'll talk about here in a little bit how Ronald Reagan kind of changed that a little bit, interestingly enough. But yeah, before we leave Nixon in the 1970s here, I want to talk about what's known as the Southern Strategy. And bottom line up front, the Southern Strategy is a claim that originated from the 70s that Republicans and primarily Richard Nixon's campaign were intentionally targeting Southern white Democrats to become Republicans by appealing to their racist tendencies. And in a nutshell, this whole Southern strategy is patently false. And the main reason why, although I'll break it down into three little sub reasons, the main reason why the Southern strategy is false is because the strategy implies that there was an intentional effort by the Nixon administration to do this. And the reality is there is not a single shred of evidence to support that. Conversely, Nixon actually had very pro civil rights policies, the biggest one being desegregation. If you're trying to appeal to a group of racist white Southerners who were very pro segregation, by the way, you probably shouldn't become a champion of desegregation, which is exactly what Richard Nixon did. The fact that there are so many inconsistencies of which his segregation, or rather desegregation policy, is just one of them. There is no strategy. Rather, what I would like our listeners to consider is that this whole Southern strategy ideal is a very emotionally satisfying explanation for why so many Southern Democrats in particular started becoming Republicans in the 60s, 70s, and beyond. So in a nutshell, if the Southern strategy is false, then what is the explanation? And the reason why I'm bringing this up is kind of now that we've talked about Vietnam and Nixon, kind of in the 70s, the political parties began to essentially switch on a lot of key issues, not on all of their issues, and we'll explain that here in a second, but on some major issues, there was a flip-flop, particularly in the South, or the Southeast states, for our international listeners. There were three main reasons why I believe there was this big switch. And those three things can fit into two categories. There were economic reasons and there was religious/moral reasons for this happening. So, number one, since the New Deal, again, FDR being the quintessential Democrat, Democrats on the whole became more and more in favor of supporting higher taxes to support social programs. The LBJ was looking at the New Deal when he was formulating his Great Society program in the 60s, and he was going, okay, this was wildly popular in the 30s coming out of the Great Depression. Let's do another one. We've clearly got a lot of domestic issues. Let's do it again. The problem, and the general principle that I'm sure we'll talk about in future episodes, is that when you want the federal government to do more things, you have to pay them more money, and that means higher taxes. Southern middle-class folks are not in favor of higher taxes. And economically speaking, the South is much more rural than more urban areas up in the Middle East, i.e.,
I think you mean
the social
I think you mean the Northeast. Oh,
over in the Northeast, right? Not the Middle East. We've got some social programs going on in the Middle East, and nobody likes them.
Maybe the Middle East of Massachusetts or something like that.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, the southern areas are a lot more rural than the more urban areas in the Northeast. So number two, as the American economy skyrocketed in the 20th century, more and more Southerners became middle and upper class, which was a demographic that Republicans had primarily dominated since its existence, beginning in the 1850s and 1860s. Normally, again, if we think of Republicans as the party of business or big business, as some people like to, pejoratively say, if you're trying to start a business, lower taxes and deregulation helps your business. That's just a fact of the matter. And if you're, a middle class person and you're starting a business, then you might tend to become sympathetic with Republicans in that party. So there's some major economic factors there. And then lastly, so those are the two main economic reasons. Lastly, I think a lot of commentaries miss this point here. The religious right began to emerge in the 1970s in response to what they believed was a moral debacle of the 1960s. Because the Democratic Party supported these movements, the sexual revolution in the 1960s, there's a lot of religious people in the South. You know, for a long time we've called it the Bible Belt, and they don't support those kinds of policies.
I mean, I think is actually one of the another major one. Like we said, this was the first time that you started getting a very continuous news cycle from not only Vietnam, but even back home. Living in the Bible Belt in the 60s, imagine turning on the TV and seeing what, you know, it's a bunch of hippies. It was like a culture war. The Democrats were the party, had become now this party of this kind of upper class, college educated, these hippies who go to Woodstock and hang out and smoke dope. And suddenly a lot of Southerners are seeing that on TV and they're like, that's not my party.
Don't want that.
Don't like that. Just, so I think,
and let's remember, now, Roe v. Wade was ruled in 1973. A lot of which Roe v. Wade was championed or was supported by Democrats during that time because, you know, they had bought into the sexual revolution, etc. A lot of Southern evangelicals who historically considered themselves Democrats looked at that and was like, no way, I can't get behind that. So I had a lady remark to me back in the 90s, and I will never forget this. She told me, I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me. And I think that was a sentiment shared by a lot of people in the South. And it has absolutely nothing to do with race or ethnicity or anything like that, which is why I think the Southern strategy is a thinly veiled attempt to try to vilify Republicans as a bunch of racists, it's such a cheap race card to play. And it's unfortunate because it's not based in any reality, and it doesn't help us move forward in understanding what's changing.
The only thing they could really draw on is maybe the Dixiecrats. You know, there was a small sect of Southerners who were pro-segregation. I think they nominated Strom Thurmond as their candidate, but a lot of that came immediately post-World War II, the 50s, and I think it basically died out by the time George Wallace ran for president. So, I mean, and it was such a small sect, it never really gained enough momentum as a political movement to classify, well, to base a whole Southern strategy on and flip some states. And I would also say, you couldn't say, hey, I'm just going to get a bunch of racists on my party and throw everybody else under the bus and then win 49 states, which Nixon won in the election of 72. He won 49 states. It was like, I think he had 520 electoral votes. He demolished George McGovern.
And again, let's be clear about what the Southern strategy is, or what it claims. It claims that Republicans had a strategy to appeal to racist white voters. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. Was Strom Thurmond a racist Democrat? Yes. Were there lots of, people, I'm not going to claim to know any kind of percentage, and I think that's irrelevant to the point here. The point is that the Southern strategy claims that Republicans were being intentional about recruiting racists, and there's no evidence for that whatsoever. Kind of moving on from the 70s and kind of this flip-flop here, we now come to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is the quintessential Republican of the 20th century. And what's interesting is that he is coming on in the middle of this big switch for Republicans and Democrats. Ronald Reagan spent the majority of his life as a Democrat. from California. He was the the Democrat governor of California. I like to think of Ronald Reagan as the ultimate pragmatist. That's not meant to be pejorative. That's just meant that Ronald Reagan was just trying to do what he thought was best for this country. I would put FDR in the same category. As a lot of times people label FDR as a socialist when he wasn't. FDR, again, was a Democrat, which was traditionally the party of small government, but he massively increased what the government could do because he was just trying to get the country out of the Great Depression. He was trying to get people to work. So Ronald Reagan is similar. So there's some inherent contradictions in Ronald Reagan's policy that I think are explained by his pragmatism and the fact that he was in the middle of this massive switch between Republicans and Democrats in their historical voter bases. So kind of giving a little bit of context here for Ronald Reagan coming into office. Ronald Reagan was elected in the 1980 presidential election largely on a referendum of Jimmy Carter, which, by the way, it's worth noting just to kind of reinforce the point about evangelicals. Jimmy Carter was a Christian and American evangelical, and he was largely elected as a Democrat because he was able to get a lot of the Southern evangelical votes. I believe he's from Georgia. And he was able to meet that. He was still able to get elected because people weren't a big fan of Nixon. Ford took over and then pardoned Nixon, which kind of made Ford look bad. But he was an evangelical, and people were able, a lot of Southern still Democrats were able to support him because he himself was a strong evangelical. So Ronald Reagan here was elected because the Carter administration had some major issues that they did not successfully deal with. Inflation was a huge problem. There were long lines at the gas pump. We had difficulty navigating our relationship with the Middle East. There was the Iran hostage crisis, of which there was a botched military operation called Eagle Claw that, two helicopters crashed in the desert and multiple service members were killed. Really a black eye to the Carter administration. And Ronald Reagan was such a G that literally within hours of him being inaugurated, the Iranians released the American hostages because he ran on a platform of one of his main points was that he was going to do something about Iran. And the Iranians took him serious. So we kind of, again, see this recurring theme of Americans don't want to look weak, and we will vote for the president, regardless of party, that will put America in a better light.
Reagan being a referendum on failed policies for the previous, honestly, decade. The 70s were pretty bleak after Nixon was impeached. I think America, and this is really hard to quantify, but American pride, it seems like, was probably at an all-time low. We had a depressed economy. Our foreign policy was a disaster. What was it? Desert Eagle was a disaster in Iran.
Oh, I thought it was called Eagle Claw.
I think the American people were Eagle Claw. Eagle Claw was a disaster, and Reagan ran a campaign. An ad campaign called It's Morning Again in America. And if you haven't seen it, just go YouTube it. It's actually pretty inspirational. And honestly, it's probably where Make America Great Again got its roots. We say it's like, oh, they want us to go back. Like, this kind of ideology and thought process has been used before. It was literally like the sun's coming up on America again. We're back, baby. And he kind of captured that. And what I think that means is it harkens to the Republican ideals of like, hey, we're going to take care of Americans first. Like, we don't need to focus on boycotting the Olympics because we're mad at the invasion of Afghanistan. We're not going to spend 15 years or whatever in a third world country fighting a war that nobody wants. It's like we may have to take a strong stance internationally against the Russians, but we're going to do so in order to avoid another
Yeah.
conflict. Kind of a complicated situation. He also had a working relationship with Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House, I think, for the Democrat, and he was a Democrat. But they had a very solid working relationship. So when you say he's a pragmatist, like he was willing to work and cross the aisle and kind of do that whole dance with the opposition for the good of the American
Yeah.
people. And I think Tip O'Neill did the same.
Reagan was just a good dude. Like there's a lot of good dudery going on in the White House there during the Reagan years. I do, however, love the SNL skit where Reagan was very successful in painting this persona. I don't think uh, he was lying, but he did paint this persona of like he's this nice guy, he's getting along with everybody, he's trying to do what's right for the country. But then Iran Contra happened, which, oh, by the way, Iran Contra was absolutely during a time of where government agencies were more or less like allowed to run hog wild on some things, in which Iran Contra was the DOD and the CIA definitely running hog wild. It wasn't like Reagan plotting in the background, but for the SNL skit, they made it seem like it was, and it's hilarious. They basically have like Ronald Reagan, I forget the actor. He's like sitting in the White House. And he's like, "Oh yeah, it's just good being here, and doing great by Iran." And then it's like, "Oh sir, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North's here to see you." And he's like, "Bring him in." And they're like, plotting is like, "This is how we're gonna do this." Like he's this evil mastermind. And then it's like, "Hey sir, the press is here to come to." He's like, "Oh, get him out of here!" And they all leave, and the press comes in, and he goes back to being the super nice guy. He's like, "Oh, I don't know anything. What's going on about Iran?" Anyway, it's a hilarious skit.
Well, he was actually a pretty, public face. He was very funny. I'll never forget. Well, I wasn't alive at the time. Never forget watching the YouTube video. It was him and Walter Mondale. Where was I when I watched this debate? I was like 18 watching a YouTube video of him debating Walter Mondale, and they bring up because Ronald Reagan was also old. He was very elderly. He was like Joe Biden's age, and they go.
He was the oldest elected president at the time.
Which, so there you go. I think they brought up, his age. Was that going to be a factor in the campaign? And he just turns and he goes, "Well, I never thought I'd let my opponent's youth and inexperience hold. I never hold that against him." Walter Mondale's like 72, and it was that kind of humor, and his delivery is fantastic, and it's that kind of persona that I think captured a lot of people. I would almost compare that, and actually I do compare that to Barack Obama, where people see that and it's this grand persona, this charismatic person who, you hear him talking, you're like, man, like I really like that person.
Yeah.
I'm going to make a decision based on emotion and what I feel in this gut feeling because I feel like I'd want to have a beer with him. JFK is a young guy. I want to hang out with him. Well, Ronald Reagan's really funny. He was an actor. Barack Obama, man, just he gets it. He wants some change. It's time for some change. So, I think that he was able to do that really well. And I don't know what that has to do with the Republican Party, but I just thought it was a little tidbit on Reagan.
Yeah, no, well, he was very relatable. Yes, he was a Hollywood actor. Yes, he was the governor of California, right? For a time.
Yeah, actually, he was. So he was the governor of California. He ran on the Republican ticket, or excuse me, he ran in the primary for the Republican ticket against Ford, and I think he lost in '76. He did lose, obviously, to Ford in '76.
So, like, he had been in politics, but he was not a career politician. Same thing for Barack Obama, by the way. He had been in politics. He did one term in the Senate, and then ran for office successfully for the president. And what advantage I think that gained both of them was they had political experience. Like it wasn't their first rodeo, but they still were relatable to the average American citizen. They were definitely wealthy. They were definitely upper class, but they had not, it wasn't like they had been in office for decades doing all these random things and had completely lost touch. There were a lot of Americans that related to both of them. Donald Trump, he had that factor about him where he spoke to a lot of Americans and they felt like he understood them. Not agreeing if the real estate mogul from New York understood the conservatives in the South, but the fact that he wasn't a career politician was like, he had that going for him in that people were like, yes, this guy understands how I see the world.
Somebody said, and I can't remember who I'm quoting here, so I apologize for not giving you credit, but somebody said he made people who had been forgotten for generations feel loved again. And that, honestly, you can hate him, you can hate his tweets, and a lot of people did, but they were like, dang it, I feel like he gets it. He went to coal towns, he went to formerly very blue areas in the Rust Belt and places like that. Talk about a Southern strategy. He kind of had a Rust Belt strategy. He went to a lot of these places that had been depressed and hit hard and forsaken by the party that had for a long time been their benefactor, and said, hey, they've forgotten you, but here, Papa Trump's got you.
So, and this is something worth mentioning here. And I hate it when people call him like Daddy Trump. Oh, it just grinds my gears.
Please edit that out because I was joking, but I don't want people to think I was. Or you can leave this little bit in to explain.
I don't know if how many Democrats that we have listening to this podcast. I really hope we have many. I would love for Democrats to ask themselves the question, why have the most successful Republicans all been former Democrats? Ronald Reagan, Donald Trump.
Technically Abe Lincoln, because the Republicans weren't around when he had to start into politics.
Yeah. And it's like, instead of just claiming racism, which is what the Southern strategy essentially is, like, okay, what if it's not racism? What if it has something to do with the fact that the Democrat Party values have changed, and the direction that the party is going towards is not consistent with historic American values? Quite frankly, I believe, and this is kind of going back to what we were saying at the very beginning of our last episode, American people don't really change that much. The larger context of what's going on, that's fine. But like, kind of similar to Rome, in that even at the height of the Roman Empire, a lot of Roman emperors and senators really just claimed like, oh, we're a bunch of simple farmers. Like, I don't think there was a propaganda aspect to that. They were appealing to their original agrarian roots. But then part of that was also like, it was true. Like they see themselves in what I believe Americans see themselves as, hey, we're over here kind of in our own hemisphere with Canada and Mexico and South and Central America. We're not trying to like cause any problems for the world. We're just trying to make a better life for ourselves. We're not trying to conduct these ridiculous social experiments. We just want to be left alone, hence the isolationist aspect, and we want to be free to do what we want.
I am convinced that if you were to take an unbiased poll and go to a 35-year-old, let's say just a 35-year-old man that is white, black, Hispanic, and Asian, and say, hey, what do you want? I bet you those answers are like 95% the same. Chances are they have a family that they want to take care of, they want to make money, and they want a better future for their kids and their family. They want their family to be safe. They want their kids to have a better future for them. I'm convinced that is and I'll be honest, they probably have a lot more in common with each other than what they're led to believe by the 24/7 news cycle. And actually, I think this is a good segue into the 90s and kind of where we talked about them unraveling in the 60s, where the roots of what we're seeing today and the real unraveling that we have now kind of get laid. And with the 24/7 news cycle and political parties truly becoming antagonistic toward each other and turning the average American against one another. So, Jay, let's go from Reagan, this monolithic, or not monolithic, maybe that's not the word I'm looking at, this larger than life
Right.
persona and president, to the 90s in this kind of hyped up, idealized time of peace and love, and the Cold War's over. And honestly, I feel like a lot of people now look back at the 90s as like this golden decade, but there was a lot of things that were happening beneath the surface that we are seeing fruits of today. So, Jay, take it.
Yeah. So I believe the current political dynamic began during the Clinton administration in the 90s. And that's not to entirely blame Bill Clinton and Democrats. Rather, that's just to say that's the time in which it occurred. A few big things of which Colin was talking about. Actually, let me say this real quick. I think what is happening today is that Republicans are becoming, generally speaking, and when I say Republicans, I don't mean the average American who calls himself a Republican. When I say Democrats, I don't mean the average American citizen that calls himself a Democrat. What I mean is like elected Republican politicians and elected Democratic politicians. There is a big pull for Republicans to go further to the right and a big pull for Democrats to go further to the left that is more or less unprecedented in our nation's history. And it began in the 90s. So like the great schism between Republicans and Democrats really began during the Clinton administration. And the Democratic Party began to adopt non-historical issues that weren't necessarily consistent with their past, but you can kind of see them coming, as we've discussed. And then Republicans have been serving as a counterbalance against that. And as each party goes further towards its corner, the more conflict. And again, these are the elected politicians. I truly believe that the majority of, and I don't have a good survey. If this is just my opinion, I believe the majority of Americans are in the middle, that they don't necessarily have like an ideological allegiance to Republicans or Democrats, because frankly, Republicans and Democrats aren't ideologically consistent over time. And that we just, again, like you said before, we just want basic things. We want to be left alone. We want like freedom to do what we want to do. And
we believe this party might most closely align with the way we want to get these things.
Right. Another thing that started happening in the 90s was the rise of the 24-hour news cycle and political commentary on both radio and TV. So, CNN becomes huge in the 90s. Fox News, not quite as much in the 90s, but also really starts getting going in the 90s. One guy that's worth thinking about here, because I think he explains quite a bit, is Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh was hugely influential on the Republican Party, especially during the 90s. He kind of really exploded as a watchdog against the Clinton campaign, against the Clinton administration. And for hours, every single day, Rush Limbaugh would basically talk about how Bill Clinton was the worst president of all time. And what this created was you had Newt Gingrich and the conservative resurgence in the early 90s. They took back control of the House. I forget if they got control of the Senate or not. And they were not they were not in favor of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. That was bad. a lot of environmental issues came up. Go ahead, Colin.
The TPP and NAFTA decimated industry, especially the textile industry, which I have some family that work in there. And that destroyed a lot of small towns and rural communities, as well as some of these formerly Rust Belt cities and areas that, like I said, Donald Trump kind of came in, and with his strategy, a lot of these things were laid in the 90s, and we reaped what we sowed from the 90s in the 2016 election. And yeah, just want to make that point that it destroyed a lot of industry and a lot of jobs, and it created a lot of social problems in some of these small towns.
Yeah. So the Clinton administration it was an interesting time because it was the peace dividend, right? One of the main international issues that previous political parties had to navigate through, i.e., the Cold War, managing communism and the Russians in particular. At the time, it felt like that was over. We won, right? The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed. All's great and wonderful in the world. So because there wasn't this large external enemy for Republicans and Democrats, the main enemy became one another. And the big lurching menace out there was no longer Russians or communists. It was the opposing political party. And that contributed to this huge infighting. Rush Limbaugh, when he talked every single day, it was the biggest threat in the world were Democrats. And it wasn't the Russians. Like, this was just kind of what the 90s were about. And to be honest, this is one reason why it's important to look at history, big picture, as well as focused on certain things. The 90s were not a bad time to be alive. Like, the economy was good. There wasn't we weren't being attacked by anybody. Like, yes, there were some issues here and there. And I don't want to, just kind of brush those off, even though I'm sure it sounds like I am right now. Like, there's always issues, but relatively speaking to other times in our nation's history, the 90s weren't a bad decade. Heck, everyone was so happy that neon colors were in fashion for people to wear, like shorts and jackets.
The 90s fashions are back. They're back, baby. I guess I should say, I think we had a budget surplus for like 1 or 2 years. I don't know. I wasn't alive, and I didn't put the effort in for the Google search, but there was a budget surplus. I remember like the debt clock stopped, and that was like a huge deal. Yeah, you're right. And the economy was doing well. We had this cool guy, Bill Clinton, in office. The conservative coalition was cool guy Bill, which we found out later might not be so cool. Which we'll talk about in a second. The conservative coalition. So you had this kind of on the surface, what looked like a bipartisan functioning government. And then, economically, people didn't have to worry. It's interesting. It's like the thought and the burden of a nuclear apocalypse happening was suddenly gone. I think that did a lot. Like, people were like, hey, I don't have to, hope that my school desk protects me from, the sun, what the Japanese call the sun bursting. It's that's gone. There's suddenly there's no enemy. The fourth, in like Desert Storm, to show like how far ahead we were. Iraq at the time had the fourth largest army in the world, and in 100 hours, the U.S. military with some of their allies obliterated them. In 100 hours. So there was literally, if other countries looked at that and there was there's no way we could ever fight the Americans. So there was, So
still do, by the way,
and still do. Yeah, agreed.
The Russian military still talks about how we spanked the Iraqis in 1990.
There's a great book. Shoot, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. It was written by two Chinese colonels, I think in 1999, basically saying we can't beat the Americans in a conventional conflict. We have to beat them. Otherwise, this is how we would do it. Because conventionally speaking, and I don't want to go on American military power here, but the point I'm trying to make is the U.S. had a decade where at this point, we were probably at like the apex, the zenith of our hegemony. No one was even close
Yep.
economically, militarily, socially. It was like on the surface, and what we're pointing, I want to make that point. On the surface, everything was as good as it could ever get. Sorry, Jay.
Yeah.
You were
No.
saying.
No, that's good because again, it's important to note again talking about the great schism between our political parties happening during the 90s uh, was because like okay, the Republican Party began to talk about Bill Clinton like he was the worst president ever. That was partially Bill Clinton's fault, right? Like you talked about NAFTA, you talked about the TPP. There were some bad policies, but I don't know if I'd call him the worst president ever. Like, to be honest, was it Hoover before the Great Depression? He probably wasn't that great of a president.
I mean,
right? Like,
Jimmy Carter was
uh,
obviously Jimmy
yeah,
Carter had
Jimmy Carter probably had a better go than Bill Clinton. Yeah.
such a nice
Or
guy.
sorry, had a worse go.
Yeah, definitely worse. Such a nice guy. Terrible
Yeah.
president. I mean, there's all the. I mean, name me a president from the Gilded Age, and people are like, "What? Hey, who?
Yeah.
Tell me about Rutherford B. Hayes, Grover Cleveland." People are like, "Who the heck are those people?"
Yeah. And
Not to say they're
so
bad, just forgettable.
yeah, I want to bring this up because that's when this kind of thing begins, and then it goes into overdrive during the Bush administration, which is extremely unfortunate because again, Bush is a good dude. But again, just like Bill Clinton, was also his fault. Like Bush had some really bad decisions in office. Cough, cough. The invasion of Iraq, how Afghanistan was handled.
Financial crisis and
There
how he
for a little
handled
while.
that.
Yeah, the Great Recession. Like the Bush administration made some bad calls. I say that for me personally, the U.S. president that I most closely align myself with is W. Bush. Believe it or not, I don't agree with everything that he did. There were probably, even if I myself became president one day, I would probably in retrospect not agree with every decision that I made. Right? But I truly believe, as far as character is concerned, as far as policy is concerned, can I just say Condoleezza Rice was the second best cabinet pick of any president in the modern era. The best pick being James Mattis. But the like Bush put some really good people. Donald Rumsfeld, I think history is going to show that probably wasn't the right choice. But I understand again why Bush. The point being is that Bush was he was a good president that made some mistakes, made some bad calls that people suffered for, and the left ridiculed him. This was the prime time of Saturday or of SNL. Mad TV was around at that time, of the late night talk show host just obliterating W. Bush day in and day out, and the the Democrats relished in it, and the right despised it, even though they had literally just done the same thing to Clinton.
I'm going to disagree and say not. I think he was a good person. I'm not going to say he was a good president. I think the hallmark of a good president is during a crisis at least hitting 50%. I'll say it like this. I think that for the situations that he was thrust into, he made some bad calls that I think most people would.
Yeah.
He's like the Roman Emperor Gallienus. He just unsurmountable challenges that had faced him that he was just not able to really overcome. He went, Iraq and Afghanistan were handled poorly. We could debate all day how he should have done it and armchair quarterback it. He made a bad call. But at the end of the day, he still made some bad calls. He bailed out the banks, right. Bad call. At the time, maybe it didn't seem like it. So I'm not going to say he was a good president. I'm going to say he was treated unfairly, though. Very unfairly. Yeah. And I've heard him. Right. I've actually heard him speak at some events on this, and it's kind of eye opening, and you really do feel bad because he definitely carried the weight of, as he had even admitted himself, some bad decisions, and how
Yeah.
he was relentless. They insulted him, his wife, his daughters, his family, and it wasn't like he made a bad decision. We should be critical of his decision making. It was like, no, we're going to attack you at a very personal level. We're going to
Yeah.
insult your
It
IQ.
got personal.
That's the thing where I think it got unfair. He deserves some criticism for some of the poor decisions, but I would leave it at that. His
Yeah.
daughters did not deserve to be drugged through the mud the way that they were. There's several
Yeah.
skits on the Chappelle show about it, which I love the Chappelle show, but like you think about it, you're like, wow, that's really uncalled for, because they're not sending people to Iraq. They're like 20 years old at the time. So
Yeah.
all that to say is it was very unfair, and it was very personal. And then fast forward a few years, what happens? It flips, and suddenly the shoe's on the other foot.
Yep.
I don't know if that's a real
And
term. I don't know if that's a real saying, but if not, I just coined it.
No, I think it is a saying. No, you're right. And when Obama got into office, again, Republicans did not appreciate how Bush was treated in office, and the insults and disparaging was equally hurled at President Obama. And again, like, note here, I really, the point I'm trying to make here, in trying to help our listeners understand, I'm not trying to agree or disagree with Clinton or Bush or Obama and Trump here. That's of secondary concern to the main point that I'm trying to make, and that is the political climate began to be defined in the 90s and is repeatedly, and both sides are doing it, by throwing mud or shade if you're hip and just like being nasty. That combined with the rise of the 24-hour news cycle and talking heads on TV, and now we have social media where it's not even 24 hours, it's like every second of every day, just people just disparaging and throwing mud at one another. It's highly unfortunate.
So it's kind of interesting you say that, because the conversation now, it is no longer hey, talk to me about their tax policy.
Yep.
If you talk to your average person about that, they couldn't tell you anything about what this person stands for. It is almost completely emotionally driven off of what they see either from their preferred means of news. That is not good. I've already mentioned it before with the dichotomy of the two-party system, and it's win-lose. And if you have emotionally invested in one party and you believe that is your team, that is your tribe, you are going to grind your feet in, and you're not going to want anything done. And I think that's why you're seeing the political landscape get more violent, actually. And we're returning to that. You have a lot of people who they were raised in their mother's basements. They are in their 20s and they have no purpose in life. So they joined some extremist group, and that is their identity. And suddenly all these people they're hearing all of this, for lack of a better term, hate-filled rhetoric. And they're like, you know what? I'm going to get decked out in riot gear and go fight the other people decked out in riot gear. That's what happens.
Yeah. Yeah, it's super unfortunate. And to your point about, it's so much less about policy these days and much more about like personal ad hominem attacks against one another, to where, and the late night TV show hosts do a great job of this, where they'll interview folks out on the street and say like, hey, what do you think about Donald Trump's comment about blah, blah, blah? And it's like, oh, that's racist. It's like, what if I told you that Joe Biden actually said that? Or conversely, like they can do it the other way. It's like people don't actually know what policies they want. They just have sports teams, AKA political parties, that they feel this blind allegiance to, and they want to win. And that is not going to help anybody.
So, I think what another event, a significant event. So, we talked about the 90s and where that started. And then, we see it's almost like a pendulum. Rather than starting to slow in the middle, it's like it's getting more violent to each side. Um, After the financial crisis in the 2010 midterms, so to paint the picture, the Democrats had already, I think, had swept, in 2006, they swept the House, the Senate,
Yep.
and then the
Yep.
presidency in '08. But in 2010, after the financial crisis, they bailed the banks out. You had two kind of grassroots movements, the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street, that sort of
Hmm.
emerged out of this populist dissent. And I bring them both up because one is extremely left, one's extremely right, or what we would call politically right and left.
Yeah.
And I think those two are kind of another byproduct of this. Well, I am just mad. I'm emotional. I'm mad. I'm getting this. I'm seeing all these things. I don't really know how to react. I don't necessarily understand all of it. But I'm going to now use my political power in this grassroots movement to alter the party. And I think that's where you start to see it. Because in 2010, I know the Republicans took the House. I can't remember if they took the Senate or they had to wait till 2012. And then even though Obama was reelected, obviously, then in 2016 you had Trump elected, and what I think that did is we had talked about the Republicans being America first. Well, for the past 20 so odd years, I think from the Tea Party sentiment specifically, they started to perceive a shift more toward the big business type of Republicans, vice the America First type Republicans. And you mentioned it when you started talking about NAFTA and TPP in a lot of these conservative areas decimated the economy. Small town. I mean, I drive through them all the time. Small towns where jobs were basically gone overnight and economies ruined. Those people now suddenly had this movement to get behind and started shifting the paradigm of the Republican Party back to what they perceived as a more America first populist central government, but limited government. And I think that's just
Yeah.
key to note that up until the point, and I think it culminated with 2016, but up until that point, the Republicans were definitely drifting toward big business. And I think that's what's
Yeah.
going on. The fight now is you hear it all the time, neocons, rhinos, the country club conservatives who are almost kind of like the reincarnate of the Whigs, kind of the elite,
Hmm.
very wealthy. We represent some big business and status quo versus Joe Schmo steelworker whose, wages aren't keeping pace with rent. So
Yeah.
all
No,
that to say is I
it's
think that's a
funny.
significant event.
Yeah, and kind of transitioning now to just some like final thoughts here. Um, so we've kind of gone through 2 episodes worth of how we got the Democratic and Republican Party of today, and how we got to our current thing. One of the things that I've kind of learned looking through this, big picture 40,000-foot history is that both political parties have redeemable features in their history. The and we have got to get back to a time where we look back at the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and kind of what I mentioned in our last episode. If someone were to ask me the question, Jay, today, would you consider yourself to be a Federalist or an Anti-Federalist? I would say, I don't know. I like them both. Both of them had good things about them. And to be honest, I'm really glad the Constitution was ratified with a Bill of Rights. In the same way that there is nothing inherently evil about Republicans or Democrats. There's nothing inherently good about Republicans and Democrats. You can change your party platform. We've seen quite a bit of change recently. Um, the the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were able to achieve the best result through compromise, right? And am I trying to say that all issues are worth compromising on? No. Of course, there are issues that we shouldn't compromise on. But what I am trying to say is that there's probably a lot more issues than what we realize that we can actually compromise on. We I don't think normal American citizens want anarchy, nor do they want a dictatorship. They don't want to be involved in every single war, nor do they want to be completely isolationist and pacifists, right? There's somewhere we've got to meet somewhere in the middle again. We've got to stop demonizing people in the other political party, and we've got to learn to work with one another again.
Here's a great example that kind of summarizes where we haven't done it. And this is something that I think everybody would be willing to compromise on. We're not compromising on a dictatorship. To your point, some of these big issues that, yes, you can't compromise on that. But here's one. So, right, there is a bill that would give for veteran benefits. And I haven't done a ton of research on it. I've seen a little bit on the news. But basically, the Republicans voted it down. They stopped it.
Mm-hmm.
And people are screaming. They're like, well, how you don't want to give veteran benefits. Well, here's the thing. Neither side is really trying to do what's best for veterans at the point. It's still a political move. Because here's the thing. If you really wanted to help veteran benefits, all you'd have to do is draft a one-page bill. It says, we're going to give X dollars for this program. Here's the thing. They always throw into, if let's say if I'm a Democrat and I want a bill sponsored and I draft this bill, a lot of other people, especially on the other side of the political aisle in these committees, will start tacking on. You've heard the term pork and change some of the language. And I think it was it was like $400 billion, the wording of how it was going to be spent, and it was either discretionary or not. I can't remember. The point is, they did that intentionally so that they could get extra money to spend later and then pin it on the Republicans when the Republicans voted it down. Here's the thing. If you both want to help veterans, which I'm pretty sure Democrats and Republicans both want to do, just draft a one-page bill. That's all you got to do. Say, hey, we will give X dollars to these veteran programs. And if it takes 2 pages, fine. That's it. Don't be funny about it. Don't throw in funny accounting words. Verbiage so that you can utilize the money later, for some pet project that you have. Help the veterans, and then don't turn it into a politics game with Jon Stewart out there screaming and making some big scene about it. I do appreciate Jon Stewart. I do think he's done a lot for veterans and a lot for 9/11 victims. But I think the thing is, he should be mad at everybody because everybody's trying to play a little game rather than helping veterans. Yeah. And this is something that's very simple to compromise on. If you can't compromise on things like this and you can't work through it, I'm sorry, but your political system is going to come to a halt and you'll never be able to get anything done. It's just going to oscillate back and forth each 4 years. Nothing's going to get done, and the things that do get done are going to get undone. That's it.
Great point. Another kind of closing or summary comment that I'd like to make is part of the reason why we're in this super toxic political environment in 2022 is, again, and I've said it in previous episodes, we care too much about what our opposing political party is doing in another part of the country that we don't live in. This is partially because of the media, right? The media gets advertising revenue based on how many viewers it has at a specific time. Therefore, they want to get clicks, they want to get views, they want to get good ratings, and they do that by generating controversy and conflict. And the big breaking news across the screen, that's, this is important to me and I should care about what this is. So they'll talk about, we talked about Lori Lightfoot in Chicago. They'll talk about, what Ron DeSantis is doing in Florida. Like, both sides do it. We have got to get back to a time in our political system where more political questions are given to the state and local governments than the federal government. You have a larger voice in your local and state governments than you do at the federal level. The federal government should not be doing as many things as it's doing right now, unless, Congress and the people say so. And to be honest, I think that would go a long way in solving the toxic political climate, because a Republican who lives in South Carolina is very different from a Republican who lives in New York, specifically New York City. Conversely, a Democrat that lives in Austin, Texas is very different from a Democrat who lives in Seattle, Washington. They're not the same
Well,
people.
they'll
They have
probably be the
different
same, but
values.
maybe a Democrat in like Cleveland or somewhere like that, the old Rust Belt.
Yeah, the point I'm trying to make here is that I think a two-party system is good. It's definitely better than a one-party system. Frankly, I think it's better than a multi-party system too, but we'll save that for another episode. But when issues are delegated to the states as they properly should be, then if you're a Democrat living in Atlanta, you don't have to worry about the Democrat living in the Pacific Northwest because they don't have a say in the issue that goes on in Georgia.
Well, exactly. And then the larger issues are much easier to come to an actual solution because they're fewer and farther
compromise
between.
solution.
Yeah.
Right.
And I mean, the compromise solution doesn't have to be, well, we're just going to come up with something that doesn't work altogether, like our foreign policy previously, where we're just going to do a little bit of both and neither of them are going to work at all.
Right.
It's like, hey, we're actually going to put our heads together and come up with a legitimate solution.
Right.
Jay, this is a great episode, but I think we're at a point where we can close it out and save the rest for the next week. Next week, we are going to discuss the current events, how they relate to previous themes that we've discussed, and really start digging into the money behind a lot of these policies, specifically around PACs, super PACs, lobbyist groups, and how they're affecting decisions that are made today and why they can be good, but maybe bad. We'll let you decide based on what we say. Thanks again for listening. We really appreciate feedback. We've gotten a few questions that we plan on answering very soon. So please leave a comment, ask a question. Let us know what you guys want to talk about next and have us discuss. Subscribe and give us a 5-star review. Help us get the message out there. This is a great podcast. We want to spread the word for us if you can. Follow us on social media. We have an Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Links are in our show notes. Lastly, you can support us either on our Anchor page or our Patreon page. And again, thank you for listening. We'll see you next week when we continue our episode series on political parties.